My name's David Collier. I research the conflicts surrounding Israel, anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. I'm going to talk about BDS, the boycott, divestment, sanctions movement. My view of BDS is somewhat different. For much of the last 2 years, I have spent my time within the BDS camps. I go to their events, I network with their delegates, talk to their speakers, and socialise with them on Facebook. I've sat next to some of the leading lights of BDS and discussed strategy one-to-one. They think I'm one of them, a BDS activist. So when I speak to you about BDS, it comes with the experience of having embedded myself within the BDS camp. What I say doesn't reflect what they place on glossy promotional material, but rather what they believe and what they say amongst themselves. So, what is BDS? Originally, Zionists fought for the right to statehood. Then, Israel fought for the right to exist, and then survive. The opposition in these fights were those who simply sought to deny that right or existence. They fought and violently opposed Jews in mandatory Palestine, fought in the Civil War of 48, the first Arab-Israeli conflict of 48 and 49, and so on. They kept fighting and kept losing. Eventually, after decades of war, they came to realise that as it stands, Israel cannot be defeated militarily. This is the resignation stage. The basic understanding that currently armies are not going to be able to remove Israel from the map. Therefore, two main options emerge: acceptance and non-acceptance. The acceptance is what we saw emerge through Egypt signing a peace deal with Israel, through the noises the PLO began to make, onto Madrid, then Oslo, the peace deal with Jordan, and into the peace talks over a two-state solution. Then there is non-acceptance. This a marriage between an understanding Israel cannot be defeated militarily with the desire that Israel still has to be destroyed. As the acceptance group moved on to building bridges, non-acceptance sought the opposite. This can be seen in the ostracising of Egypt by the Arab states following the peace treaty, the actions of Hamas and the bus bombs during Oslo, the Intifada, Hezbollah, and persistent diplomatic actions to demonise Israel on the global stage. So, we have two entirely different narratives. The first, one of negotiation, acceptance, potential peace, the two-state solution. The other, constantly seeking new strategies to fight the Jewish state. As Oslo collapsed in the Second Intifada, a new strategy began to form in the non-acceptance camp. Based on the recent success against apartheid South Africa, they reasoned that if Israel could somehow be projected as the new South Africa, global grassroots could possibly bring about what Arab armies could not. Emerging from the anti-racist conference in Durban in 2001, the first signs of these global networks began to appear. Within months, the first academic boycott appeared inside the UK in an advert in the Guardian newspaper. Not because of a call from Palestinians over the occupation, but from anti-Zionist Jews who simply wanted the state of Israel to end. Over the next couple of years, boycott movements appeared and faltered. Not least of all because Israel is not South Africa and apartheid doesn't exist there. They also had little academic grounding, no basis in international diplomatic circles within the West, and no visible support from within the PA itself. Two separate strategies were worked upon. Both came from the international anti-Israeli movements. The first was an academic battle, to attempt to delegitimize Israel through the application of pseudoscience. If, in a post-colonial world, Israel can somehow be transformed into a settler colonial state, then its existence and legitimacy can be questioned. The second was the realization that the Palestinians themselves had to call for boycott, that this movement needed to appear as if it were a civil call from within. So in 2005, as instructed by internationally based enemies of Israel, scores of civil groups within the PA areas called for boycott. Thus, BDS was born. BDS has three central aims. They list them in this order. First, an end to the presence of Israel in the West Bank. Note, BDS does not specifically state that occupation refers to the West Bank. Like most of its suggestions, BDS prefers to remain ambiguous, not wishing to push away extremist support, but wishing to advertise to the moderate. For those who have considered entertaining BDS because of this ambiguity and the fact that perhaps occupation only refers to the West Bank, they have been fooling themselves. Imagine, if you will, a lynch mob charging down with their torches to someone's house. Those who join at the fringes, those who become part of the mob but aren't really seeking to do the man much harm, will not have a say when the punishment is given out. All they have done is empower the extremist elements at the front who are determined to end the man's life. The second aim is a call for equality within Israel itself, and the third a call for the rights of the refugees to return. BDS placed the issue of occupation and the wall first because, of course, this is the one that most moderates, students and liberals will identify with. To a degree, it also has international diplomatic support. Most pro-Israelis believe that the third aim, the one regarding the refugees, is the most insidious. They think it means that Israel will be flooded with millions of Arab Palestinians. I believe these aims are listed out of order. To understand better what BDS is about, we need to rearrange their listed aims. Now the occupation is listed third, with the refugees second. Why have I placed them in this order? I've done so because they highlight just what BDS is taking ownership of. The issue of land in the West Bank is an issue that can exist within the two-state paradigm. In fact, it is the essence of the two-state solution. The question is merely one of where the eventual borders are drawn. So we can date this aim as belonging to post-1967. The refugee issue will eventually need to be solved through negotiation. Theoretically, it can be solved without harming Israel. The refugees in Jordan simply become Jordanian. The nonsense of a Palestinian inside PA areas calling himself a refugee can also be set aside. Perhaps a symbolic number can move to Israel, and a compensation agreement that is built to also include compensation for the near million Jewish refugees that fled or were expelled from Arab lands can bring an end to all these claims. When led by extremists, this particular aim does mean the end of Israel, but theoretically it could exist within the two-state paradigm. Once again, BDS is deliberately relying on ambiguity. We can date this aim as belonging to 1949. And then we come to the Arabs of Israel. The democratic state of Israel provides freedoms that Arabs throughout the region can only dream of. Without much argument, Israeli Arabs are in a healthy position vis-à-vis their freedoms. And yet BDS has visibly crossed the international Israeli border to begin to make demands there too, and in doing so has explicitly declared itself as part of the rejectionist non-acceptance camp. They would argue, first, that apartheid exists there, which it doesn't. They suggest that Arabs are not equal, citing a few laws that set Arabs apart. In this, they count all laws that benefit soldiers, and anything related to the Star of David or the Israeli flag. It is a nonsense. A desperate attempt to cloud over what they have done. They have ignored Israel's international border. This aim has to be dated pre-1948, before Israel's creation. They may try to argue that it isn't about borders, it's about human rights. They become universalists who simply seek equality amongst all peoples. And yet, they went westwards towards Israel and crossed the border, yet did not go east. Had they gone east, they would soon have found themselves in Jordan, a state created at the same time as the British Mandate in Palestine from the very same lands, a state that has many Palestinians living within, a state that is not democratic. If they had gone north, they would have arrived in Lebanon, a state that practices apartheid against Palestinians. Yet in these cases, BDS stopped precisely at the international border. Universalists, they are not. There is only one international border BDS ignores: Israel. It has nothing to do with human rights or universalist principles. They have explicitly targeted the freest Arabs in the entire Middle East, simply because they live in the Jewish state. BDS is therefore not a pro-Palestinian movement. It does nothing to build, to create, to invest, to assist, or to promote Palestinian interests at all. It doesn't even operate in some areas where Palestinians suffer grave oppression. We have seen BDS cause Palestinians in the West Bank to suffer from the loss of jobs. BDS is a movement that is explicitly anti-Israel. It exists well within the non-acceptance camp. It seeks, as did the Arab armies, the destruction of the Jewish state. And, just like 1948, these extremists do not care what price the Palestinians have to pay for it. A few short words about misconceptions and BDS. BDS is not a thing. There is no HQ, no leadership. They have their staffs, that is, people who are articulate, who travel to speak at universities and so on. But they're not an organisation with an internal structure. This is their strength. They act like a religion, using areas where condensed groups of potential converts exist. The university space is a perfect example. Unions are another. Anti-war groups, movements that are anti-West. Anywhere that people congregate that might be disposed to aligning, for whatever reason, with BDS goals. BDS has flattened the conflict out of existence. Note, they almost never talk about peace. If BDS were to mention peace, they'd have to explain the conflict. If they explained the conflict, it quickly becomes apparent there are problems with their story. So, BDS activists simply talk in keywords of justice and human rights. Peace isn't relevant. Within these areas, BDS can spread as a cult does, using scripts that are devoid of context, devoid of factual elements, and simply regurgitate mantra. And from here, anybody can begin a BDS action. They can choose whether they only attack settlements, the West Bank, the Golan, Jerusalem, or Israel proper. Some have even targeted Zionists living in the diaspora. It also allows for different groups, such as LGBT and Islamists, to absurdly stand under the same umbrella. BDS ensures that elements that would offend each other never have to meet. Right-wing Nazis and left-wing communists. Each group operates independently and within its own world paradigm. Jew haters, universalists, Islamists, communists, Nazis. BDS becomes all things to all people. It is a brilliant strategy of deception. So not everyone who is anti-Israel is an anti-Semite, but anti-Semitism is a glue that holds the entire movement together. The effective PR turns the cause of the destruction of a democratic state into a left-wing humanitarian ideal that virtue signallers on social media are happy to identify with. You cannot destroy an idea, but you can render it meaningless. There are three main ways to defeat BDS. One is through education, to let people know the real narrative. The second is legislation, to restrict the ability of BDS to operate. And the third is to toxify it, to highlight what BDS actually is and to make people wary of associating with it. So, when you come across it, how do you oppose this hatred? BDS is underpinned by three main issues. Apartheid, that is, that Israel is the new South Africa. Nakba, or that in 1948 the Jews simply expelled the Arabs. And settler colonialism, the product of the academic pseudoscience fight against Israel. The idea that Jews are simply a bunch of Europeans who 100 years ago decided to invade a random nation in Asia. These are all false, and yet they do form the very basis of the argument for BDS. The apartheid argument is absurd and a horrific insult to black South Africans who actually lived through an apartheid regime. The Arabs inside Israel are the freest in the entire region and all vote. If only all the Arabs in the Middle East were as free as the ones in Israel. You may see racism, as you do everywhere, but there is no apartheid. The West Bank and Gaza are conflict situations, an issue that needs to be resolved between Israel and its neighbours. Nothing to do with apartheid at all. Hiding behind the apartheid label to con Western youth to associate the Jewish state with apartheid South Africa is a vile strategy. Nakba. The argument over the events of 1948. As part of their activism, people such as Ilan Pappé produced works that attempted to entirely rewrite the conflict. What occurred in reality was a civil war. The United Nations offered 2 states for 2 peoples and the Jews accepted. The Arabs did not. Within days, Jews were being attacked. Within weeks, foreign Arab troops had entered into British Palestine and civil conflict opened throughout. To replay this as a pre-planned expulsion of innocent Palestinian civilians is nonsensical. The Nakba narrative is entirely false. At one event I went to, a speaker named Rivka Bernard from a group called War on Want knew so little she ludicrously suggested both sides rejected the partition. This ignorance from a person willing to seek the destruction of a democracy. At another event, I heard a narrative where the partition was not mentioned at all. Like any civil conflict, it was bitter and bloody. No doubt massacres of some description occurred on both sides. No doubt too that in some areas controlled by both sides, people were forced to leave. With Arab irregulars operating in some towns and Zionist supply lines threatened, clearing an area for military advantage may have been a logical and required step. Several areas on the Arab side were entirely cleansed of Jews. This was an existential fight. The vast majority of Arabs fled voluntarily. Anyone who doubts this needs to look at the refugee crisis today. All you need is civil conflict. People run. It is what people do in these situations. In reality, the Nakba is that Israel didn't lose, that the Jews survived. For some, like those behind BDS, this is the catastrophe. In truth, The Arabs started a conflict that sought to destroy the Jews, and they lost. Settler colonialism, the pseudoscience, or the academic attack. To make way for the removal of Israel through the rejection of its legitimacy, the soul of Zionism has to be destroyed. The Jews, persecuted throughout history and seeking the right of self-determination, returning home to the birthplace of their people. Zionism is a national liberation movement. Instead, BDS tried to turn Zionists just into a group of white Europeans seeking an Asian nation to invade and settle. This paradigm is so false that you wonder how it is even supported in the minds of the extremists that promote the idea. It comes along with accusations that Jews are descended from Khazars, anything that unravels the ties of Jews to the region. It is far removed from historical reality, yet remains a science financially supported on campus by international anti-Israeli movements. When fighting against this type of hatred, remember, you do not actually have to fight. Sometimes it is better just to walk away. The core argument on their side is so flawed that if you engage with a true BDS zealot, you might just be wasting your time. It takes a lot of stupidity to believe that the world is flat. Sometimes all the truth, all the science in the world won't shift a true believer. Pick your battles. Historical facts are the killer blow to BDS. BDS avoids debate because of them. Theirs is a story that only works in a vacuum, where truth and knowledge must not enter. If you engage, go for the soft underbelly. The two-state scenario only arose in 1936 because the Arabs would not stop killing the Jews. The 1947 rejection of partition, the civil war, the Arab irregulars, the lack of a Palestinian state between 1949 and 1967. Remember, back in the 1930s, those Jews the Arabs were killing were the refugees fleeing from the Nazis. If you want to understand who is on the left and who is on the right, imagine where you would place someone who today started to kill the refugees fleeing from Syria. Always attack BDS. Don't defend Israel. This isn't about whether or not Israel is guilty of some things. Israel does not have to be perfect. The question is the legitimacy of the BDS argument and the aims of the BDS movement. What BDS does, when it engages, it doesn't come to argue the facts. BDS is not a trial. BDS is a punishment. So imagine, if you will, this situation. A group of people come up to you in the street and tell you you've been sentenced to death. Why, you ask? Because you are guilty of theft, they respond. Which theft, you ask? And so you engage in a conversation about this theft that you have been found guilty of. In taking this approach, you not only empower these people, you give credit to their argument. The problem is not what you may or may not have done. The problem is, who are these people? What do they want? Where is their justification for gathering together in the first place? Who made them the judge? BDS use all of the conflict arguments to support their cause. They talk about settlements, for example. BDS don't care about settlements. Settlements are part of the argument within the two-state paradigm and have no relevance to BDS. When you begin to discuss settlements with a BDS activist, you have entered a rabbit hole, an argument designed to simply get you lost in the warren and make it seem as if you are defending the indefensible. All these issues are rabbit holes. Gaza, child prisoners, the occupation, checkpoints. All of these discussions are part of the two-state paradigm. Israel's behaviour inside the West Bank has no relevance to its right to be an independent state. To those on the side who listen to the exchange, these people, they have no context. They don't understand the conflict. All they hear is that a settlement has been built, a wall has gone up, a child was arrested, and then they hear you try to justify it. There's no point. Don't defend Israel's actions post-67 in an argument about BDS. Attack BDS. When you do this, you come off script. In general, the people pushing BDS do not have a grounding in the conflict. Those that do only take their information from extremely dubious sources. I was at a BDS training event not long ago, and they role-play with would-be activists. It was informative because it was so accurate. They know the pro-Israeli argument, so they teach them to deflect. They have standard responses to accusations, such as the one that suggests they are anti-Semitic. One-line responses that are learnt parrot style. If they can deflect this criticism, they then regurgitate a few statistics about child prisoners, and they're on their way to seeking new converts. They want you and expect you to use the argument that you cannot boycott Israel because it makes too many things. For them, this type of argument is great. You seem to be saying that Israel is guilty but too powerful to boycott. Confrontation is not something to be scared of. The vast majority of activists would not last a minute in a discussion on the conflict. They have a leaflet that says Israel is guilty of genocide. That's enough for them. Truth doesn't matter. So in public it is easy to expose this ignorance by simply driving home the real narrative. Talk, facts and history. You will lose them within a minute. Don't go down any rabbit holes. And highlight the contradictions. Refugees are always a good one for this. Talk about the abuse of Palestinians in Lebanon. Over the last 70 years, those Palestinians remained the most abused. If you are a humanitarian cause, why not push for Lebanon to give rights to those born inside its borders? Use the democracy arguments. They have no rational response to this. Highlight the violence of the mandate or the rejection of the partition. Israel's attitude towards LGBT is one that is so strong they seek to defend it by creating the idea of pinkwashing. This, as Palestinian gays still seek refuge in Israel. How many times have the Arabs had the chance for peace but rejected it? Why do BDS pick and choose which international rules are important and which ones are to be ignored? One more thing. For those that are interested in peace, surely the outcome of BDS is of the most importance. But what does BDS do? Israel is a nation that was created through persecuted people going to Israel. Whether it was back in the late 1800s, early 1900s from Eastern Europe running away from the pogroms, from the rise of the fascists, escaping the rise of the Nazis, surviving the Holocaust, whether it was escaping the persecution and expulsion from lands like Yemen or Morocco or Iraq or Egypt, or then again after the fall of the Soviet Union, those that had suffered the persecution of the years under the Soviets. This is Israel's population. Outside, they see angry people who want them to open the door. They're never going to open it. It's not going to happen. The only thing BDS will do is reinforce the Israeli image that the world hates them. In other words, the BDS narrative from the Israeli perspective cannot work. If we look at the Palestinian perspective, well, the Palestinians are basically being told, don't negotiate, wait. BDS will give you everything, which they won't. But in the meantime, another generation or 2 generations of Palestinians are lost. BDS absolutely demotivates both sides from negotiation. And since 2005, the peace process has absolutely stagnated. I don't believe it's a coincidence. And remember, if it is post-67, it is relevant to Oslo, not BDS. So final points to remember. BDS exists in the destroy Israel paradigm. It has nothing to do with peace. BDS has no central brain. It is not an organisation. BDS is contradictory and hypocritical. All of its arguments do not hold up. BDS needs to convert people, not tell the truth. They will be standing there speaking ridiculous lies without blinking. These are people that have not got a clue about what it's like over there. This is why you see ridiculous circulations of the facts in January where Israel opens the dams to flood Gaza. Southern Israel floods in January, as does Gaza, because that is where it is. There are no dams, but these people don't have an idea. BDS deflates the atmosphere for negotiations and peace. You cannot repeat this often enough. Most of the virtue signallers that attach themselves to BDS do so because they believe the PR. They believe this may be a way of pushing for peace. And BDS is anti-Israel, not pro-Palestinian. Bottom line, use your narrative, not theirs. Don't play their game. My blog, Beyond the Great Divide, can be found at www.david-collier.com. If you've enjoyed this video or you enjoy the blogs, please do consider making a donation. The work I do, going to events, writing up reports, the blog and creating these materials is time consuming and very expensive. Anything you can give would be truly appreciated. You can reach me or make a donation through the website. Thank you very much for listening.